it might be a minor change, but it is a change in the presidency of the US, because you have the president elect who, when he was in office before, basically pulled out of the Paris Agreement.
You're listening to CESaRE Voices, conversations that bring you closer to the world of Caribbean environmental and renewable energy research. Our wetlands and mangrove forests are arguably unsung heroes of the global quest for carbon neutrality. As it is, we don't hear enough about the tremendous role they play in preventing coastal erosion and protecting coastal communities from the increasingly destructive weather events brought on by climate change. But we hear even less about their ability to help mitigate the climate crisis by capturing and storing massive amounts of carbon dioxide. That's why we're lucky to have organizations such as the Institute of Marine Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. Their work revolves around monitoring and managing these important habitats, addressing issues caused by global warming and human activities such as tourism and coastal development. The Institute is currently collaborating with the Inter-American Development Bank to establish a blue carbon credit scheme in Trinidad and Tobago, the first of its kind in the English-speaking Caribbean. Its successful implementation could create new opportunities for the Twin Islands to finance marine conservation efforts. Of course, we wanted to learn more, so we tracked down Dr. Rahanna Juman, Deputy Director of the IMA, who was more than happy to oblige.
Now, in setting up a scheme, you have to have, first of all, a rigid data set. You have to have quantify how much carbon is stored within your ecosystem.
So let's talk a little bit about our coastal habitats and the work being done to maximize their effectiveness towards mitigating global warming in this episode of CESaRE Voices. Rahanna Juman has a long history studying mangroves and wetlands, and much of it involves work she's done with the Institute of Marine Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago.
So the Institute of Marine Affairs is a government-funded marine research institution. So we were actually set up back in 1976 by the UNDP, but have been under the control of the government since. And we were formed by an act of parliament. So we're a statutory body, so we run our own affairs. And our mandate is to basically conduct research in the marine and coastal environment and provide advice to the government and to the people of Trinidad and Tobago on the sustainable management of our natural resources.
Rahanna's been with the IMA for over 28 years. She started out as an intern after completing her bachelor's degree, but after spending a few months working with the Institute's wetlands ecologist, she was inspired to go back to school to become one herself, studying the Buku Reef Bonaccord Lagoon system in the process. Now holding a PhD, she was officially hired as a research officer at the IMA, and according to her, has filled practically every position ever since, including her current role as the Institute's Deputy Director. Now, mind you, this doesn't begin to cover the extent of her commitment to her cause.
Back in 2015, I decided to go and do a law degree. So I also have an LLB. And the reason for that is because you sit on a lot of advisory committees or committees that have to develop policies and so forth. And you realize that the scientists and the legal people, they don't communicate. They don't talk the same language. So I felt if I understood how, the folks that make the laws think, that we would be able to make better laws or better policies. So I got involved in that, and I've been, since 2012, I've been actually leading efforts in Trinidad and Tobago to develop a integrated coastal zone management policy, which was approved in 2023 by Cabinet. So, we talk about integrated coastal zone management, we talk about ecosystem-based management is one of the same. And it's about helping us to manage our resources, but also to adapt to the impacts of climate change, especially on our small islands.
This gives us an idea of the work being done behind the scenes to protect important habitats that can help us adapt to climate change and even possibly mitigate it. One of the IMA's most recent projects serves as another good example of this.
We've gotten a technical cooperation with that is funded through the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, and it's to basically pilot a blue carbon credit scheme for Trinidad and Tobago.
Now, before we go any further, it might be helpful to get a better understanding of what we mean when we say blue carbon credits.
So first of all, let me explain what is blue carbon, right? So blue carbon or blue carbon ecosystems are primarily mangrove forests, seagrass beds, and marshland. And they're considered blue because they're ocean-based ecosystems or ecosystems that are impacted by the ocean. And what we have found is that these ecosystems capture and store more carbon dioxide in their biomass as well as in their sediments than terrestrial forests. So while in the past we talk about them helping us adapt to the impacts of climate change by providing coastal protection and so forth, we're now understanding how important they are for climate mitigation as blue carbon ecosystems, because now they can capture and store carbon dioxide. And as you know, carbon dioxide is one of the main greenhouse gas that has been responsible for climate change.
All right, so now we know why they're called blue carbon credits. And as for what the credits themselves are, well, carbon dioxide is pretty much the same gas regardless of its location on our planet, which allows for some flexibility in our approach to decarbonization. That's the basic principle behind carbon offsetting, a voluntary form of carbon trading that allows companies and individuals to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions by investing in projects that reduce emissions elsewhere. This is where carbon credits come into play. These are generated by projects working to mitigate overall emissions by doing things such as building wind or solar farms or restoring and protecting habitats proven to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Each credit accounts for 1 metric ton of reduction or avoidance and can be purchased and traded in the carbon market once it's been certified. See, this part's important. For your credits to be valid, you have to prove that your project is achieving measurable results and that each credit actually makes a difference.
Basically, we're saying that if we rehabilitate degraded ecosystems, those systems will capture a lot more carbon dioxide. So that will be carbon dioxide taken out from the atmosphere, and they'll hold that carbon dioxide. Now, in setting up a scheme, you have to have, first of all, a rigid data set. You have to have quantify how much carbon is stored within your ecosystem, right? So one of the things we have to do is to set up an MRV system. That's monitoring, reporting, and verification system, right? Because if you want to be credited in order to participate in any kind of carbon scheme, you have to have this MRV and this rigid data set. So the first thing is the data collection. So the initial component of the project is looking at the ecological, hydrological, and socioeconomic environment of particular wetlands, and then looking at rehabilitating these wetlands, right? So a big part of it is wetland rehabilitation. And then, of course, after you rehabilitate a wetland, and if you want to use this wetland for any kind of carbon scheme, you have to also have management intervention. So mainly a management plan, and has to have some sort of protection and management so that it could continue to provide this ecosystem service, which is carbon capture and storage, right? So all that is part of the system in developing a carbon scheme. Now, this has not been done for any of the English-speaking Caribbean, so this is a pilot project for us. So it's a lot of learning in the process.
Creating a carbon credit scheme is definitely uncharted territory for the IMA. But when it comes to the habitats likely to generate the credits, they're standing on very familiar ground.
So the IMA would have done work before, as technical, would have collaborated with the IDB in projects dealing with things like integrated coastal zone management. So they're aware of us, and we've been doing research in coastal wetlands for a number of years. And we had a proposal to rehabilitate particular wetland areas. So through the discussion, these things came about. Also, to the IMA, in conjunction with the University of the West Indies, had started a project where we were using a new method, a terrestrial laser scanner, to actually scan the mangrove trees in 3 dimensions to work out what you call an allometric equation. In addition to that, we would have had LiDAR survey. The government would have purchased LiDAR survey back in 2014, so we would have been able to get the topper canopy height. So we could have accurately estimate how much carbon is actually stored in the above ground biomass. And then subsequent to that, we would have gotten some funding from the British High Commission to look at carbon storage in the sediments. So it sort of kind of like took off from there, from previous work we would have done to try to estimate or collect the data for estimating carbon storage, both in the above ground biomass as well as in the soils.
These data collection methods have been the key to understanding the carbon storage potential of Trinidad and Tobago's wetlands and mangrove forests. And it really boils down to the mechanisms through which they're able to store so much carbon in the first place. Here's a quick explanation by The Economist.
All trees need carbon dioxide to grow. As they absorb it from the atmosphere, carbon becomes locked within the tree's leaves, branches and roots. Parts of the tree eventually fall off into the soil where they decompose, releasing some of their CO2 back into the atmosphere. But mangroves are different. Their tangled network of roots traps this carbon-rich plant material in their waterlogged soil, sealing it off from the atmosphere. This vault of carbon can remain secure for millennia, as long as the mangrove forests remain intact.
As that clip just pointed out, it's a specific structure of trees such as the red mangrove that makes it all worthwhile.
Red mangroves in particular, which is one of the dominant species, has really large, what you call prop root system. So these large roots that come down from the trunk to hold it, because remember, it's in the intertidal where it's mushy. So they have these large structures that provide support. So the carbon is, captured and stored in all these prop roots, but they have never really been properly quantified. So that's where the methodology was used to try to quantify not just the trunk, which is typical allometric equation that foresters would use, but try to quantify all the prop roots and everything that the mangrove has.
Tools such as terrestrial laser scanners and LiDAR have enabled researchers like Rahanna to look more closely than ever before at structures that can often be difficult to access. But more traditional techniques still play an important role in ensuring accuracy.
The LiDAR would have been used to do the digital elevation models, but you still go in and you verify data by doing on-the-ground data collection measurements. You check to make sure what you're getting from the LiDAR is similar to what you get when you go and you measure on the ground. With everything, you have to do a certain level of ground truthing. So we've done all of that work. So we have a pretty good idea of where things are, how they are. As a matter of fact, about 2 years ago, I published a book on mangrove forests of Trinidad and Tobago.
The importance of data integrity can't be overstated here. I mean, we've heard numerous reports over the years of fraudulent practices and fruitless efforts by projects that sell credits. This issue is often cited by critics of carbon offsetting as evidence of its ineffectiveness as a mitigation strategy. Effectiveness isn't the only major concern, though.
November last year, on the Lafini Land Reserve in the Republic of the Congo, government ministers, to great fanfare, launching a high-profile carbon offsetting project with French oil giant Total Energies. The aim, to plant 40 million trees in the coming decade. But now an investigation by journalists working for Greenpeace UK Unearthed and the source material website, and shared exclusively with Sky News, suggests the project has come at a significant cost for an estimated 400 farmers and their families who own or use the land. To make way for the tree planting, some say they've been blocked from their fields without consultation or payment. It's left some worrying about feeding their children. Documents show that by the time some had accepted money to give up their fields, the government had already changed the law more than a year earlier to become the private owner of the Lafini Reserve. That land then quickly subleased via a forestry consultancy to Total, with reassurances from the government that anyone else trying to use it would be evicted. Other documents show that after Total's planting scheme began, the Ministry of the Forest Economy acknowledged in this report a range of other problems with the project, including complaints from unpaid families, confusion over land rights, and a lack of leadership.
That was a Sky News report from 2023, and there are many more where that came from. You see, there's actually a pretty well-documented history of human rights violations connected to projects that generate carbon credits in countries like Kenya, Uganda, Cambodia, and Colombia. That was what we had in mind when we discussed the IMA's approach to setting up its own scheme.
So this is a 3-year project, right? And it's made up of 4 main components. And we're trying basically, we're following, the best standards in terms of our high quality carbon credit scheme, which, includes things like, of course, transparency, engaging with both public and private sector, but also too in terms of community and community livelihoods, improving on livelihoods for communities. So we're looking at all these different aspects of these wetland areas. The focus is, of course, in Southwest Tobago, and we're comparing it to the Caroni swamp in Trinidad.
Would you be able to tell us a bit more about the decision-making process itself?
So it's highly consultative. So, I mean, in terms of determining the size, we would have consulted with the representative from the Tobago House of Assembly, right? Because, of course, they are the ones that stand to benefit from a project like this as well, and the communities in Southwest Tobago. And these are sites we know that requires rehabilitation. In blue carbon credit schemes, what they focus on is rehabilitating degraded ecosystems, because then as the trees grow, they're going to take out a lot more carbon dioxide.
Okay. You spoke about community there. Can you talk a bit about the way that this project will impact the local communities in the areas of focus?
So part of it is that, again, you'll be rehabilitating ecosystems, you're rehabilitating mangrove forests. You have folks that depend on mangrove forests for their livelihoods, folks like the crab catchers, as well as the fishers. So it provides those co-benefits. Also to any scheme, if there's a way, and I don't know, because we have to look at the institutional and legal arrangement. But a lot of these schemes, how they work outside of Trinidad and Tobago and other places where they exist, is that some kind of benefit from selling the carbon is transferred back to the communities. you
Right.
know so I mean, that's exactly what we would want, but we would also like to create livelihood opportunities, sustainable livelihood opportunities as well, whether it's things like honey keeping. They utilize mangroves for honey production, as well as ecotourism. So ecotourism is also important too. So if you have the structures and you have the biodiversity and it's healthy and you have birds coming in and so forth, you could then take folks in as an ecotourism, sell it as an ecotourism product, and it kind of fits into Tobago's overall objective of being a green, clean, serene island, that sort of stuff.
That kind of brings me to this question. Can citizens or even corporate entities get involved in the project itself?
Definitely. So in developing the scheme itself, we'll be looking at developing a toolkit, and also doing training after it has been developed. And a lot of that training has to be done with potential investors, folks who would want to invest and of course purchase some of this carbon to offset their own emissions. So definitely engaging with investors, private sector interests, ministries of finance and government entities that have to set the rules, for something like this to work. A lot of companies have their own strategic vision, and a lot of them want to be like zero carbon emission by 2050. So, this of course could be something that they could invest in, rehabilitating degraded ecosystems that can then offset their carbon emissions.
In its effort to establish this carbon credit scheme, the IMA is doing its best not to run into any issues. But of course, there are always potential variables that can't necessarily be controlled.
Simple things like if you have change in the governance framework, change in government, change in administration, things can get delayed, things could be slowed down because you have to get certain approvals, even changes within the organization in terms of staffing and so on could have, some could possibly have an impact. Even something as, it might be a minor change, but it is a change in the presidency of the US, because you have the president elect who, when he was in office before, basically pulled out of the Paris Agreement.
Right.
So we don't know what will happen with regards to carbon credit schemes and so forth. Something that we have to consider. So yeah, most of it would be like change in administration, then things that could possibly, I'm just thinking of some of the risk, is sometimes you may not adequately cost a particular activity. So you may have to look at additional funding to execute. Those are some of the things that could be a risk. Of course, you would always have to engage and get buy-in from the communities. You must always have to engage with stakeholders and let them be part of the process.
One major criticism of carbon offsetting is that it allows major polluters such as oil and tech companies and the airline industry to carry on with business as usual, while reaping the reputational benefits of pushing for carbon neutrality by simply outsourcing the real work to others, often disrupting people's lives in the process. But there's another side to this story, one that involves people like Dr. Rahanna Juman, working to restore habitats crucial not only to climate change mitigation efforts, but also to the survival of local communities. And for these people, carbon offsets represent a much-needed source of funding that could truly make an impact. Carbon trading is by no means a single answer to our climate predicament, and its current mechanisms could definitely use some serious improvement. But with the right approach, it can help us tip the scales on climate change by providing a means to support projects across the globe that genuinely contribute to decarbonization, such as mangrove restoration efforts in Trinidad and Tobago. A successful blue carbon credit scheme in the Twin Island state could point the way forward for other Caribbean states who could use carbon credit proceeds to achieve key sustainable development goals and reduce reliance on international aid. But the IMA knows it needs to set the right example, one that emphasizes the importance of proper monitoring, reporting, and verification, and the need to protect the rights of our citizens. Anyway, that's all we have for you on this episode of CESaRE Voices. We'd like to thank our guest for taking the time to share her insights with us. We'd also like to thank our funded partner, the Barbados Environmental Conservation Trust, or BECT, for making this episode possible. BECT aims to help Barbados reach its national development goals by supporting local initiatives aimed at environmental sustainability. Of course, we'd also like to thank our listeners for tuning in to the CESaRE Voices podcast. If you like what you've been hearing so far, feel free to give us a rating wherever you're listening. We'd also like to remind you that you can visit our website, CESaREjournal.org/donations, to lend your financial support. Or join our monthly donor club on Patreon to gain access to exclusive content, or even be featured in an episode of our podcast. Just click the link in the description. You might also want to check out the CESaRE Journal YouTube page for exclusive clips and videos on all kinds of topics related to Caribbean sustainability. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode of CESaRE Voices and feature your company or NGO, please click on our corporate link to learn more.